Hi everyone, how are we doing today? So I'm going to be going down a little rabbit hole about Henry Ford and some interesting things you may or may not have known about him. And I didn't want to do like a typical biography type of video. We're just going to talk about some weird stuff. So buckle in for this. So Ford Motor Company is iconic. He completely changed the way that we made vehicles through an assembly line instead of making them one at a time from one car start to finish. And it was the Model T that was the first car to ever be mass produced on that assembly line. It really made cars go from a luxury toy for rich people to something that everyday people could afford. And while Henry Ford did some cool things, there's also things that he did that make you think, like, what the fuck, Henry? So Henry Ford was born a farm boy. He did things like plowing fields, planting crops, tending to animals, riding horses, like country boy stuff. But he actually really hated it. So think of Luke Skywalker, where he wants to go off to like Jedi school or whatever, and it's like, oh, after the next harvest, and it's kind of like that. He wanted adventure. He wanted to see the world. And he really looked up to Thomas Edison. He wanted to do big things with his life. One thing he did love, though, was the idea of making money, and a lot of it. And that was going to be a challenge for Henry in the future because he was so busy doing farm boy stuff. He didn't have a full education. He stopped school after 8 years. So he could read, but just barely. And he never had that social interaction which you'd need during school, and he was just very socially awkward. So I'm going to take us a bit into the future, into 1914. So the Model T is a big hit in the assembly line. Cars, they're just cranking them out. And one car, it would take 12 hours to build, and it got down to an hour and a half per car. Workers, they got bored. Instead of working on a project from start to finish, they were only responsible for one component. And they got bored and they just quit. And the turnover rate ended up being about 370%. Ouch. So to combat this, Henry Ford doubled their wages to $5 an hour. And that was insane. People swarmed the Ford factory to put in applications. And this was good on a few different levels. So turnover rate dropped down to 16%. Other companies were like, oh, we need to keep up and up to their wages, so that's good for the workers. And Ford, he got all of this publicity. I can lisp is strong today. But he got all this attention, and he loved it. And something else that I found weird was the workers that were working on these Ford vehicles were now making enough money that they could now afford to buy the vehicles that they were working on. Sorry. And back then, $5 a day in modern day standards, that's about $150. So it's a job that has relatively a low skill set, and they train you. And $150 a day, if you think about it nowadays, imagine flipping burgers and getting that. That's a pretty good deal. That Ford didn't like, the Jews. He blamed Jewish people for everything. So women wearing short skirts, lots of makeup, flappers of the 1920s, blamed it on the Jews. Alcohol, cigarettes, jazz music, he blamed that on the Jews. Then theft and robbery, blamed that on the Jews as well. The fuck? And then it was in 1918, Henry Ford purchased his hometown newspaper. It was a little while after that he started publishing articles basically about how much he hated Jews and, in his words, how they were infecting America. And he ran this newspaper series for 91 issues. It even got to the point he had all of his articles put into a book, and he sent those off to his dealerships, newspaper subscribers, basically anyone that wanted a copy. And he ended up printing 500,000 of those books. Ford was one of the biggest celebrities in America. People looked up to him, people listened to him, so obviously that's a big problem. And one of those people that looked up to him was Adolf Hitler. It was in 1938 he received the, can't remember the name of the award, but he got an award from the Nazi regime for his work. Okay, it was called the Grand Cross of the German Eagle. Not that that's important. And then Henry Ford, he inspired Adolf Hitler with the idea of an assembly line and producing a car that everyone could afford. So that's how we get Volkswagen. And then Hitler also created the Autobahn, which inspired President Dwight Eisenhower in the 50s to create the American highway system. It's called something like that. Basically, that's how we have the interstate highways now. But anyways, not relevant. And then Henry Ford, it just kind of sounds like he had a rotten personality. He was disrespectful to his staff. It was speculated he had a mistress at some point in time. He was one of those people that would make really mean jokes and just laugh and say that he was joking, but we all know you're not joking. Like one of those types of people. And said he was just kind of a pathological liar and just full of shit. One article I read described him as a child let loose in a sweet shop. So he sounds like he was just kind of a giant man-child. And he also kind of had this chip on his shoulder. He's self-made millionaire, and he wasn't very educated, and that always kind of bothered him. He always felt that people should be talking up to him and speaking to him in a better way. He kind of just had a really big ego. Then, luckily, his son Edsel, that probably sounds familiar, and Henry Ford II, they turned out okay. And Henry Ford II was the grandson. And the grandson, the second, he felt really bad. He spent his entire life just trying to, he says, atone for his grandfather's sins. I believe he did. And then the last thing I want to talk about, and I had no clue about this one. This one's really cool. It's called a place called Fordlandia. It's also called Fordland, but that's just not as fun. So in the 1920s, the British had a monopoly over rubber. And rubber was used for tires and then other random car parts. And rubber actually comes from trees. It's called Ficus elastica. I had to look that up. It's actually, I'll put a picture of it. So Ford ended up buying about 2.5 million acres of land from the Brazilian government. And Henry didn't have to pay export taxes on anything that he sent out. He just had to pay 9% of the profits. So the Brazilian government got 7%, but the local townspeople only got 2%. Which is, what the fuck, Henry? Come on. And then it was 1928, Ford sent out a couple ships with supplies, went down to Brazil, and promised all of the local townspeople housing, food, good wages if they came to work for him. And people from all over showed up. So after they set up camp, things aren't going so well. So the Ford company managers, they were strict as fuck. Okay, no cigarettes, no alcohol, absolutely no women allowed. And they weren't even allowed to play football or soccer. They weren't even allowed to do this in their own homes either. And Ford managers, they would come and check. And they wouldn't just check for contraband or women. They would check to see how clean your house was, too. Ugh. And these workers, they also had a hard time with the American culture shock. Like, what the fuck is a hamburger? Why does food come from a can? Why do I have to wear pants? What is this ID badge? And they also didn't like having to work in the middle of the day. And then with rubber trees, as the temperature goes up, the rubber moves further up the tree, so they'd end up having to climb higher up and do more work, and yeah, no. Hard pass. And that's what the Brazilians did. They were like, fuck this. So instead of staying in the Fordlandia camp, there was a little river, and they went 5 miles upstream is where they stayed. So they had bars, they had working girls, like life was good, and they wanted to de-stress. They weren't used to the long work days. It was something very foreign to them. And then I thought this was funny. This is something I would totally do. They would take watermelons and hollow them out and hide contraband for when they went back into Fordlandia. Well, the workers that hadn't quit yet. Then there was also an issue growing the rubber trees. No one at Ford had been in a tropical climate. They knew absolutely nothing. So they planted all of these rubber trees really close together. And they planted them away from other plant species that they kind of relied on each other for plant survival. So they had ants, caterpillars, spiders, different tree diseases. Just, you don't want to fuck around and find out in the Amazon. And, well, they did. So after not doing so well in 1934, they just scrapped Fortlandia and moved about 25 miles south to a better growing climate. And then it was about in 1944, 45-ish, synthetic rubber became a thing. And that put Fordlandia, or Fortlandia Part 2, out of business. So Henry Ford II ended up selling the land back to Brazil at a loss of $20 million. And that was like back then money. Today would be about $300 million. And then what I find really weird is that through all of that time, Henry Ford, he was writing the checks for this. He never actually went to go and visit. Like, just dropped all of these millions of dollars and never once got on a boat to see what was going on. Doesn't that just seem weird? I just can't. Like, imagine just writing checks for millions of dollars and just not giving a single fuck. Anyways, today Fordlandia is still abandoned. There's a few thousand people that still live there. Most of the original buildings are still up, except for the hospital that got raided by looters. But the original structures are still there. And obviously the Ford Motor Company is still around today, and the family is very much still involved with it. I think they own about 40%, but don't quote me on that. And they've made millions of cars and even more in profit. There's something in like 2021, they made over $136 billion. Right. And that, my friends, is where I'm going to leave you today. I had a lot of fun just going down this random, weird rabbit hole. I get so wrapped up in it. Hopefully I've entertained you a bit with my chit-chat. Maybe you've learned something along with me. It's always fun to learn more about the cars we drive. Are you still going to buy Fords? I still am. I've bought so many. I'm just going to keep buying them. Now I have a 7.3 OBS. It's slower than a Prius, and somehow I always break the passenger door handle. But I still love it. If you have any questions, comments, let me know down below. And I'm also on the Instagram if you want to come check me out there. And I'll see you next time. Go do like a smoky burnout or something for me, okay? Bye.